Hello. So, chapter 3 goes over the overview of schooling in America. So, it kind of gives you this broad overlook about how the timeline and laws of education have changed over time. And I will upload this chapter 3 PowerPoint, but I wanted to use this particular timeline just to review some of the key events in American education. So if you might notice that early on in schooling, really school was isolated to young, wealthy white males, also who owned land or their fathers owned land. So it was very limited as far as who could receive an education. And that education, largely in part, was a kind of an apprenticeship education, so learning a trade. You did have a certain population, particularly the more wealthy ones, that were learning reading, writing, arithmetic, liberal arts studies, those kinds of things. But largely, they were there to learn a trade. They were there to learn a skill. And then you have the introduction of the Latin grammar school, which is more of that liberal arts kind of education. As we fast forward through to about the late 1800s is when you see the first compulsory education or attendance law, meaning that students had to go to school. And then slowly over time until the early 1900s is finally when all states adopted that compulsory schooling. So in our first early schools in the 1700s, school wasn't required for everybody. In the late 1800s, the politicians began to realize, okay, in order for us to have a successful nation, we need to have an educated citizenship. Not necessarily that they were illiterate, because 90% of white male were literate. So it was highly politically driven that we need to have an educated populace in that late 1800s, early 1900s. If we continue on, we see in the late 1800s is when the Committee of 10 actually recommended a high school. So early on we had elementary. We didn't have necessarily this idea that we have a high school version. What's very interesting is the Committee of 10 kind of talked about what that high school should look like. And many of the components of what we see in high school now was devised from that Committee of 10. So Committee of 10 is the one who said, here's the courses that you need. So way back in the late 1800s, kind of determined what your high school experience looked like today, which is interesting. And then if you'll notice that the first junior high actually opened after kind of the curriculum or the Committee of 10 decided on the high school. So it's kind of this weird combination of how schools were decided. And they actually decided on a middle school just because they noticed that that particular population of students wasn't necessarily getting what they needed to get out of education. And then as we progress through, you see some of the historic laws, Brown versus Board of Education, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Title IX, IDEA, A Nation at Risk, and No Child Left Behind. So let me touch on those very, very briefly. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was actually started by Lyndon B. Johnson, and it was his attempt to have this war on poverty. So at the time, there was a huge population of people in our country who were living under the poverty line. And so it was a way to address those students in our schools. And so it wasn't this law that was designed to put more tests or change the curriculum, but it was really designed to help students who were living in poverty. So that was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Title IX has to do with discrimination laws. However, in schools, a lot of times we look at Title IX as athletics, so having equal access to athletics for both boys and girls, but it goes way beyond that into anti-discrimination laws. And where we're kind of seeing that play out today in our current times is with transgender bathrooms, transgender locker rooms. So how does that play into anti-discrimination Title IX laws? And then as we move forward, we finally see that there are some laws in 1975 that address students with disabilities, and that's called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that actually started based on a parent advocate saying, you know what, we're not receiving the types of supports that we need in public schools. Our children are entitled to a free and appropriate public education just like every other student. So we'll go over IDEA in more detail as we kind of move through the semester, but in general, that's what that law is about students with special disabilities or special needs. Then we see A Nation at Risk, and A Nation at Risk was actually as a result of our falling test scores in science. It was also kind of to do with our war against Russia and other countries as far as who's better at math and science. And so Ronald Reagan said, you know what, we're not doing so hot. So it was kind of a return to this focus on core academics. And then as we move through with the No Child Left Behind Act, which probably most of you are familiar with because that's kind of the legislation that you grew up with, or NCLB, is a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So it's not new. It's kind of saying, here's some of the changes we're making to that original act in the ESEA. And the major thing that it did is ESEA already had standardized testing in some of the other reauthorizations that happened prior to NCLB or NCLB. So there was already testing in those laws. What NCLB did is it extended the testing, instead of saying like 3rd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade, to 3rd through 8th, all every year will have a test, and here's the test that they will have. It also looks a little bit at AYP, which is adequate yearly progress, which says if you are not making adequate progress from year to year with these certain students, then your school is failing. So it's some of those kind of hard lines that has given NCLB a bad rap or puts bad taste in people's mouths. But standardized testing has always kind of been a part of our public or federal laws. It's just to put more of an emphasis on those standardized tests. Now, Texas is the one who made it high stakes testing, which means that it's connected to whether you pass or you fail. NCLB did not make it high stakes testing. It did not require that students fail the grade because they failed the test. That was Texas's doing. So that's a little bit different. And now we're going through another reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Race to the top is what Obama has called it. So we're going to see another few changes that are coming through with current educational law. So that's kind of an overview of some of the main points of Chapter 3. It continues to go into some of the philosophies, but you'll hit more of that in Chapter 4.